The woke right have taken over gaming discourse, but what does that even mean? In its journey through mainstream media and political discourse, woke has become a kind of Rorschach test. To some, it still means being socially conscious. To others, it's synonymous with performative activism, over-the-top political correctness, or even a threat to their values. Increasingly, it's just used as a catch-all insult to describe anything someone finds annoying, usually left-leaning or unfamiliar. It's no longer about specific beliefs, it's about vibes. Because of this ambiguity, people often ask for a definition not just to understand what someone means, but to challenge whether they do mean anything at all, as a way of exposing lazy rhetoric or pushing someone to clarify whether they're criticising actual ideas and policies or just using woke as a stand-in for things I don't like. In many debates, asking for a definition puts the burden of precision back on the person throwing the word around. But what if I told you it's not just people on the left who behave so-called woke? Some of the most vocal opposition to progressive ideologies is often dismissed as merely reactionary or contrarian. After all, they've built a whole identity on being the antidote to what they claim is a broken, over-politicised system. Yet their tactics, tone and tribalism mirror everything they claim to oppose. These people are the woke right. So, before we go deeper down this gaming rabbit hole and get into what they actually stand for, it's worth examining how they present themselves, how they operate, and why their rise has been so effective in today's online ecosystem. I am Lady Decade. If you like spicy gaming conversation, hit that subscribe button, as this is the story of the woke right gaming takeover. Thoughtful, resonant, and visually stunning Western games can still exist. Look no further than Expedition 33. It's the kind of title that reminds you what this medium is capable of when it's not shackled by corporate mandates. With its painterly art direction, emotionally grounded world building, and a tone that manages to be mature without being miserable, Expedition 33 feels handcrafted, like someone actually cared. No bait, no checklist, just good game design. It's not just a standout RPG, it's proof that Western developers can still create magic when they stop trying to please everyone and start building something with heart. What's better is that I can get you 40% off at the usual price of this game, as well as some of the best releases this year. How about 39% off Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, 23% off Doom The Dark Ages, and so many more. Save huge money by using the links below. Happy gaming and happy shopping. When I first started making some videos about gaming's culture war last year, it felt like a refreshing change of pace. After years of exploring retro consoles and obscure hardware oddities, shifting to some more opinion-based content gave me a chance to speak more openly and give my thoughts about what was happening in the industry today. And to be clear, I wasn't jumping on a bandwagon. I already had an audience. I already had a platform. This wasn't a pivot. It was an expansion, and I ended up engaging in some very interesting conversations. But while this style of content was merely added to my repertoire, since then I've watched a wave of creators emerge whose entire rise hinged on culture war content and nothing else. Not gaming, not design, not history, just outrage. And it's not hard to see why platforms like YouTube, Twitter and Reddit are built to amplify emotional extremes. The more provocative or polarising the take, the more engagement it gets. After all, nuance doesn't trend. But rage bait does. It's a dynamic that's been evolving since at least Gamergate in 2014, when what started as a conversation about journalism ethics rapidly devolved into harassment, tribalism, and a hyper-politicised lens on everything from character design to developer hiring. A lot of the backlash during Gamergate was rooted in legitimate frustration about transparency, media bias, and about the creeping sense that certain voices were being prioritised over others in the industry. Concerns about ideological conformity and gatekeeping weren't imagined. But there's no denying that some people took it way too far. What could have been a reasonable pushback against corruption and insularity spiralled into dogpiling, doxing and outright cruelty, which then overshadowed many of the valid points and gave critics an easy way to dismiss the entire movement. which, in my opinion, wasn't an ideal outcome for anyone. In many ways, the culture war as we know it today began there, and the tactics haven't changed much since. While progressives on the left, those often labelled as woke, tend to attract the most criticism, sometimes deservedly, the backlash hasn't given rise to a principled resistance or a thoughtful push for balance. Instead, what's emerged is something far less constructive. A group that I and others have started referring to as the woke right has ended up adopting many of the same behaviours they once mocked. Constant moral outrage, online pile-ons, an obsession with identity, and fixation on surface-level controversies. In their pursuit of cultural victories, they've become nearly indistinguishable from the very people they claim to oppose. Now, just to be clear, this isn't about moral equivalence. I'm not saying both sides are identical or that all concerns are invalid. What I am saying is that the most extreme voices on either end have become part of the same machine, one that thrives on division and keeps everyone arguing about symptoms while ignoring the real disease. And in doing so, they've handed corporations a convenient distraction by fixating on individual reviewers, tweets, or bits of box art. They divert attention from the structural forces that actually shape the industry, things like marketing mandates, investment strategy, and shareholder oversight. While discourse spirals around the latest IGN headline, the people making the real decisions, executives, conglomerates, and asset managers, carry on largely unchallenged. Essentially, both groups serve as useful idiots to those at the top. And yes, the woke left's excesses are well documented, and I've been vocal about them, but the woke right has, in many ways, become a reflection of the very thing it set out to resist. What began as fair criticism highlighting hypocrisy, bias, or double standards has drifted into mimicry. The same moral grandstanding, purity tests, and calls for cancellation have crept in, just from the other side of the aisle. Gaming discourse has become less about critique and more about performance. Being loud, indignant, and algorithm-friendly often gets prioritised over being thoughtful or well-informed. And while the spotlight stays on phrasing, character outfits, or social media missteps, the underlying machinery of the industry, who funds what, who controls the output, who benefits, remains firmly intact. To be clear, when I refer to the woke right, I'm not talking about people with centre-right views or those offering fair, grounded criticism of modern gaming trends. I'm referring to a more reactive online faction that has positioned itself as the cultural counterweight to what it sees as progressive overreach in the industry. This group tends to focus on ideological signalling in games, criticising gaming journalism, and interpreting design decisions as political statements, even when the context is more complex. This perspective gained renewed visibility in early 2024 during the Stellar Blade controversy. An IGN France editor suggested that the game's depiction of its lead character could contribute to negative mental health outcomes for women. The article included a now-deleted passage implying that the design was killing women, which many players saw as an overreach, and rightly so. The backlash was swift, and IGN France later issued an apology clarifying that its editorial team operates independently from IGN's main site, but by then, the moment had already crystallised a narrative that mainstream games journalism had become detached from the concerns of most players. And it was absolutely more than fair to be ridiculing these poorly written articles. This wasn't an isolated case. Hogwarts Legacy, released in 2023, became a similar flashpoint. On one side, progressives called for a boycott due to J.K. Rowling's statements on gender identity. On the other hand, anti-woke commentators framed the game's existence as a rebellion against leftist censorship. Yet despite the online uproar, the game went on to sell over 12 million copies in its first 2 weeks. For most players, the appeal wasn't political, it was the chance to explore a well-built wizarding world. Or consider Forspoken. The game was criticised online for forced diversity and awkward dialogue, quickly turning it into a culture war punching bag. But its real problems, according to both critics and players, were inconsistent gameplay, technical issues, and weak narrative execution. These examples show how surface-level cultural narratives often overshadow substantive critique. What followed after Stellar Blade was telling. Instead of focusing on productive media analysis or calling for higher standards, much of the reaction descended into binary labelling. Games were dismissed as woke propaganda based on a single quote, trailer, or character design. Individual choices were treated as evidence of wider conspiracies. Criticism began to mirror the very tactics it was reacting against. And in that shift, something important got lost. Rather than unpacking how corporate structures, investor influence and access journalism shape the games we get, much of the conversation narrowed in on individual community managers, tweets or marketing slogans. Complex development environments were flattened into talking points, and the real story, the systems that actually influence creative decisions, was buried under layers of outrage. People are so stupid. What's become increasingly apparent is that the extremes on both sides of the gaming culture war now echo one another, despite loudly claiming otherwise. On the progressive side, or so-called woke side, certain strands of commentary can drift into overreach. Criticism sometimes prioritizes optics, such as character design, identity representation, or thematic messaging, over core elements like gameplay, narrative cohesion, or mechanical depth. In these moments, it can feel as though a game's value is being assessed more for how well it aligns with a particular worldview than for the quality of the experience itself. But the woke right has developed a mirror image of this behaviour. Rather than advocating for creative freedom or calling for better industry standards, some voices now focus on cataloguing perceived ideological content, a hairstyle, a colour palette, an optional setting. Any one of these can be interpreted as evidence of political intrusion. The result is a running tally of supposed infractions, often stripped of context or intent. A good example of this feedback loop in action was The Last of Us Part 2. The game was heavily review-bombed over its LGBTQ+ representation and narrative direction, with much of the backlash framed as a rejection of forced messaging or agenda pushing. At the same time, critics who supported the game pointed to the backlash as proof of entrenched bigotry within the gaming community, but lost in the middle was a balanced conversation about what the game actually accomplished, both technically and narratively, and what didn't quite land. And this kind of polarization is far from accidental. Outrage performs well. Platforms like YouTube, Twitter and Reddit are engineered to amplify emotional extremes. The more divisive the take, the more engagement it generates. Moderate or nuanced perspectives rarely trend, not because they're wrong, but because they don't keep people arguing. So the cycle continues. One side overreaches, the other reacts. And each uses the other's worst moments as justification. And while this plays out, the real issues, monetization models, labour instability, creative interference, go largely unexamined. This isn't just exhausting, it's counterproductive. It traps the entire conversation in a loop of manufactured bullshit and distraction. Both sides claim to care about the future of gaming, but most of the energy goes into dissecting surface-level controversies. Meanwhile, the underlying systems that actually determine what gets made, economic pressures, risk calculations, production pipelines, carry on in the background uninterrupted. In the end, it stops being about games because it becomes about being right. One of the most frustrating aspects of the gaming culture war is how effectively it keeps attention fixed on the symptoms while the actual disease goes largely unexamined. A clumsy review, a tone-deaf social media post, or an awkward soundbite from a developer becomes the headline. Not because it's the most significant issue, but because it's the easiest to react to. These moments are emotionally charged, algorithm-friendly, and highly shareable, but beneath them lies a much deeper problem. The way corporate structures, investor demands, and brand risk frameworks quietly shape the creative direction of the entire industry. Much of this is driven by the same entities behind the scenes. Investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard hold major stakes in the world's largest publishers, and that influence extends far beyond quarterly profits. Games media outlets, meanwhile, are often owned by the same conglomerates or tied into the same capital networks, creating a feedback loop of overlapping interests. This isn't some hidden conspiracy, it's corporate governance working as intended. Terms like ESG and DEI often get thrown around in these debates, but rarely with clarity. ESG refers to the criteria investors use to evaluate companies' ethical and sustainability practices, including things like workplace diversity, climate targets, and board transparency. DEI refers to corporate efforts to promote diversity and reduce inequality in both hiring and creative output. While these frameworks can encourage meaningful change, they can also be implemented superficially, more for branding or investor optics than actual impact. And then there's access journalism, a media model where coverage often softens in exchange for early access, exclusives, or advertising relationships. Instead of asking hard questions about a game's development or structural constraints, many outlets lean into cheerleading, PR rewordings, or vague hands-on impressions that keep relationships intact. These are the real problems that are ruining gaming, regardless of what your personal politics happen to be. Despite all of this, much of the outrage we see, particularly from the woke right, rarely goes beyond these surface-level critiques. There's relentless fixation on outsourcing studios like Sweet Baby Inc. or out-of-context tweets from staff, but comparatively little analysis of how investor expectations, monetization strategies, or brand protection drive development decisions in the first place. It's a narrow view that ends up serving the status quo. As long as we're shouting about representation in a cutscene, no one's asking why a single-player game has a battle pass. And this focus on individuals, especially junior developers or community managers, isn't just unhelpful, it's misplaced. Most of the people working on these games are just that, workers. They're navigating production timelines, budget constraints, and managerial direction. Blaming them for top-down decisions made by executives, shareholders, or consultants only lets the real decision-makers off the hook. If we actually want better games and a healthier industry, we have to go beyond surface-level outrage. We need to ask harder questions. Who's funding the project? Who benefits from the structure in place? And what systems are being shielded when all the public attention is redirected towards the latest identity-based argument instead of the material conditions shaping the work? The whole thing has become a complete circus. Most of the real problems facing modern gaming aren't ideological, they're structural. Increasingly, games are shaped not by creative vision but by financial modelling. We've seen single-player studios restructured to support live service demands, monetization systems embedded into gameplay from the outset, and entire development pipelines redirected to satisfy quarterly targets and marketing forecasts. Cyberpunk 2077 was a prime example. The game's technical failures weren't about representation, they were the result of management pressure, unrealistic timelines, and a promotional campaign that oversold features that didn't exist. Similarly, titles like Redfall and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League show what happens when creative decisions are rescoped mid-production to align with shifting commercial expectations. These aren't isolated failures, they're systemic ones. In Redfall's case, promotional interviews focused on its alignment with DEI goals, while the game itself suffered from technical issues, broken AI, and uninspired gameplay loops. That tells you something about where the focus is being placed. It's not that the games are failing because they include diverse characters, they're failing because they're being built around engagement metrics, often before the core mechanics are even solid. Meanwhile, layoffs have rocked the industry. Over 10,000 developers lost their jobs in 2023 alone, and 2024 has seen even more. Studios are shuttering mid-project, and entire teams are being let go after delivering games that didn't meet arbitrary benchmarks. These aren't failures of inclusion, they're failures of infrastructure, driven by the same financial logic that's distorting the games themselves. It's a total mess. One of the most overlooked aspects of this entire debate is just how many players simply aren't involved in it. Most gamers aren't on Twitter arguing about character designs or reviewing trailers through an ideological lens. They're not entrenched in cultural framing, they just want to play good games. These are the people who form the industry's core audience, but a handful of hyper-visible voices often drown out their preferences. That's part of why the discourse feels so polarised and so exhausting. The most reactionary and emotionally provocative takes tend to dominate headlines and comment sections, creating the illusion that the entire player base is split into two opposing factions, one obsessed with representation, the other furious at the mere suggestion of it. But that isn't the lived reality for most players. They care about story, mechanics, polish, and whether a game respects their time and money. They're not looking for politics. They're looking for quality. And this middle ground, where most people actually are, is rarely acknowledged. People like me, who critique both extremes and focus on structural issues, are often labelled as fence-sitters or accused of avoiding the real problems. But my position has always been consistent. I care about creative freedom, transparency, and strong design. I don't think either faction owns those values. And I'm far more interested in why the industry is struggling than in picking a tribe to cheer for. So bearing this in mind, why do so few content creators represent the voice of the majority? The more divisive the opinion, the more engagement it generates, and that doesn't mean it's going to be more accurate. It just means that it's better at getting clicks. Over time, this warps the tone of the industry, making it seem like these loudest voices speak for the majority, when in fact, they've just figured out how to game the system. While cultural discourse continues to dominate much of the English-speaking games media, it's important to recognise that large parts of the global industry simply don't operate within this framework. Across Europe and Asia, many studios have sidestepped the most polarising dynamics, not because they're apolitical, but because their priorities are different. They're more focused on delivering cohesive, well-crafted experiences than on reacting to the latest ideological firestorm. Developers like Larian, Sandfall, Asobo, and CD Projekt Red, when they were allowed to follow through on their own vision, have built critically acclaimed titles by centering gameplay ambition, player immersion, and creative coherence. These studios succeed not by checking boxes, but by trusting their teams to build something meaningful and letting the work speak for itself. None of this means these studios are above criticism, but it does show that a different model exists. One where games are judged first and foremost by how they play, how they feel, and what they offer, not how well they align with current discourse cycles. So, what can we make of all of this? At this point, it's difficult to view the gaming culture war as a simple debate. It's become an ecosystem, one built on outrage, distraction, and performative wins. And both the woke left and the woke right have carved out roles within it, feeding off one another in a toxic cycle that serves neither players nor developers. The pattern is predictable. A heavy-handed article sparks backlash, the backlash gets exaggerated, and suddenly the entire discourse is about a tweet or a costume, while another studio is hit with layoffs. The most urgent issues, creative burnout, job insecurity, and top-down financialization barely gets a mention. Not because they don't matter, but because they don't generate engagement. And that's no accident. This feedback loop isn't just exhausting, it's useful. It creates cover for the decision makers. While the public obsesses over the wrong things, content creators plough on with their theatre of reaction cycles that entertain but rarely inform. This is why I keep returning to structural critique. Because while everyone argues online, the underlying systems stay intact and in many cases profit from the noise. Now, I'm not saying there's no such thing as ideological influence in games. Some titles absolutely foreground political or social themes, just like films or books and television have always done. But the market is broad enough to accommodate all kinds of creative expression. Most players don't reject representation, they reject being pandered to. What they want is quality, cohesion, and respect for their time. It's not rocket science, is it? And yes, media bias and access journalism are real problems, but pointing fingers at individual journalists or developers misses the larger issue. A media landscape shaped by corporate ownership, algorithmic incentives, and a growing reliance on PR access over accountability. So maybe the real resistance isn't about choosing a side. Maybe it's about stepping outside the binary altogether, asking better questions, supporting games that speak for themselves, holding systems, not just slogans, to account. And above all, embracing media literacy. In a landscape where algorithms reward outrage and misinformation, the most valuable thing we can do is slow down, look deeper, and refuse to be dragged into someone else's content cycle, because great games are being made by passionate developers, thoughtful writers, and designers who care about their craft. But we only get to see that if we're paying attention to what really matters. Why is the woke right dominating gaming discourse right now? Simple. They've mastered the platforms. They know how to trigger engagement, weaponize memes, and collapse complex issues into easy-to-digest outrage fodder. Their content feels rebellious, countercultural, even punkish, despite parroting the same talking points across every channel, stream, and comment section. And in a landscape where algorithms reward friction over thoughtfulness, repetition over research, it works. What they've created isn't resistance, it's a routine, a predictable, marketable routine. The same words, the same targets, the same smug cadence, day in, day out. And here's the twist. The people who once mocked others as NPCs now behave just as mechanically. Their responses are scripted, their outrage is reflexive. They've become what they claimed to hate, just with a palette swap and a different set of approved buzzwords. Yes, their rise is partly the fault of the industry, whose cynical decisions created fertile ground for backlash, but that doesn't make the backlash smart. What we're left with is a faction as performative, predictable, and annoying as the one they set out to destroy. A culture war where everyone plays their part and nobody ever wins. Don't forget that by using my links, you can get 40% off Expedition 33, 39% off Fatal Fury, City of the Wolves, 23% off Doom, The Dark Ages, and up to 90% off of thousands of other titles. Or if you want to support my work in a more personal way and access my behind-the-scenes cosplay library and more, by becoming a backer over on Patreon.